All right, Grace, I think we've got most everybody in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington, the largest and one of the oldest indie bookstores in the region. In fact, we're celebrating our 120th anniversary this year. Thank you for joining us at what is definitely going to be a fun and informative event. We're delighted to have Dr. Rick Chromey here with us to tell us all about his new book, GenTech, an American story of technology, change, and who we really are. Every 20 years, a new generation rises, but who and what defines these generations? And could current generational tags mislead and miss the point? In this insightful analysis of technology history since 1900, Dr. Rick Chromey offers a fresh perspective for understanding what makes a generation tick and differ from others. Dr. Rick Chromey is a cultural explorer, social historian, generational futurist, and international keynote speaker. A best-selling author, he has penned over a dozen books on leadership, natural motivation, creative communication, and classroom management. His most recent work, GenTech, is an engaging romp exploring why labeling people by when they were born, like baby boomers and millennials, just doesn't work. Instead, he explores the technology we use during our coming of age years between 10 and 25, learning where people fit and the assets they bring through technology that changes lives, whether in the boardroom or classroom. Rick has served as a pastor, professor, speaker, trainer, and consultant, working in the nonprofit and corporate sectors. In 2017, he founded MANA Educational Services International to inspire and equip leaders, teachers, pastors, and parents. He holds a doctorate in leadership and emerging culture and travels the US and world to speak on culture, faith, history, education, and leadership topics. He's been interviewed on network television across the country and has been featured in national publications. Copies of the book are available on our website, and you'll see the link through the chat periodically. And if you have any questions to Dr. Chromey, this is going to be a very fun, interactive event, so please feel free to leave them in your chat. And now, here's Dr. Chromey to tell us more.
Wow. Well, thank you, Grace. I think of all the introductions I've ever received in my life, that was the most recent one. So wonderful, wonderful. You read it just like I wrote it. So
thank you. You're a good writer.
I read it just like my publicist wrote it. I'm going to see here. I'm going to get up here in gallery view. I call it the Brady Bunch view, where I can see everybody here. Hey, Lisa, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing good, and I see Russ, and is it C Young? There, is that how you?
Yes, correct.
Very good, and Mariko down there, she's got a nice picture for us to look at. The rest of you, I don't see anything, but that's okay. We can go with you know, if you can get your video on, it's kind of fun to see faces. I come all the way from Boise, Idaho, and you know, this is. We're having fun down here in this neck of the woods with all the COVID, and I know you guys have been dealing with a lot of it up there as well. But it's good to be here. Now we got a few more starting to roll in. Anyway, I want to talk tonight about generations, talk about some cultural analysis, and we've got just a short hour together. I've got a presentation that's about 25 minutes I want to share with you in just a moment. But let me just give a little background on why I do this. Several years ago, I've been doing cultural analysis for about 25 years, but in particular, I started doing a lot of research on generations, you know, about the mid 1980s, late 1980s, you know, as the millennial generation was starting to be born. I was doing a lot of youth work at that time, and there were questions about the kids that were being born. And as I started to research it, I started to realize that it was all over the map. There are all sorts of different ideas and thoughts and frames and such. And in fact, one of the books that was highly influential on generations, do you ever wonder where we got the name baby boom or baby boomer? It comes from this book right here. I'll put it up here. It's by Landry Jones. He was an editor, I think, of People magazine, if I remember right. He wrote a book called Great Expectations. It's about America and the baby boom generation. He named the baby boom generation. And Landry Jones did that naming in 1980. Now think about that. the baby boom generation, he said, was born between 1946 and 1964. It was the first time anyone had tried to frame a generation like this with brackets, so to speak. And he did that in 1980, a full 15 years after the last baby boom generation was born. Okay, let that sink in, because in 1995, another generation was being born. We call them now Gen Z. They're commonly called Gen Z, but that was that name was actually given in 1996. These kids were only 1 year old when they were given the name Gen Z, and it was by a marketing firm. And what's happened in generational and cultural analysis is that we've had marketers now trying to have this race to the top to find out who can name the generation. And I've come along from the backside just studying this over the years and went, wait a minute, there's got to be another way to look at generations. And in my doctoral work in the early 2000s, I developed what was called cultural language theory. And it came from looking back at the previous 500 years and looking at how technology has a way of shifting us and exposing us to new ways of understanding. And when you look at the last 500 years and you see what's called a modern era, so to speak, you know, you see the technologies of the Gutenberg press and the mechanized clock, and I call them the scopes, the microscope and the telescope, how those really influenced us and changed us and opened us up as culture to new experiences, whether it was a Renaissance and Reformation or Enlightenment or the age of science, the age of information. And then you get into the new technologies that started to emerge in the 40s and 50s and later, television and cell phones and the internet and how that's shifting us as well. So all that kind of played a role. And a couple of years ago, I started to put it together and I created a book that I called GenTech. And it basically is a new theory of how we look at generations. It suggests, as I'm going to show you in a moment, that we're not baby boomers and we're not Gen Xers and we're not Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, or whatever we want to call us. We are actually influenced highly by the technology that we came of age to. We're the radio generation or the television generation. So this book is available tonight. I'd love to have you take a look at it and give us a good review. Give us a review of it. We're getting some great reviews already online, but we need some friends who take a look at it as well. So Grace, are we ready to get rolling here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, before we do that, I'm kind of looking out here at our audience. How many of you, those of you who are here, are in that? Looks like most of us here are either boomers or Gen Xers, born between I'm seeing born since between 1940 and 1960, kind of, the classic baby boom generation era. Yeah. How many are born between 1960 and 1980? Kind of the classic Gen Xer. Okay, got a few there. That's where I'm at. And then I don't see, do we have anybody younger born since 1980 here? I don't know if we have any young ones here. Oh, so young, yay. Okay, we've got a young one here. Good, good. So we've got some different generations represented. And what I want you to do is write down your questions. We'll handle them in about 25 minutes when I conclude the presentation. So you ready to go? All right, let me share my screen here and we'll be on our way. Welcome to GenTech, my friends. Oh, it says that host has disabled attendee from screen sharing. I need to be able to, Grace, I can't share my screen.
Okay, Ed is our tech host. Ed, can you let him share his screen?
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, should be able to do it now. All right, here we go. Well, it's the single greatest question that a human being can ask. In fact, I believe it's the greatest question that only a human being can ask. It's the question of who am I? Who am I? You know, all my life, I've been tagged a baby boomer. I was born in May of 1963, nearly 6 months to the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The baby boom generation, as I just shared, was between 1946 and 1964. So my birth in 1963 assigned me to that baby boom cohort. But the problem was, I've never felt like a baby boomer. It wasn't who I really was. You see, my first cultural memory wasn't of a dead president, but it was of a live moonshot. That's what I remember first. I remember well watching Neil Armstrong. Maybe you do too. In fact, I imagine most of you do. Watching Neil Armstrong gently hop to the dusty surface of that lunar rock, pronouncing it's one small step for man, but one giant leap for mankind. Now, that was a cultural memory moment for me. But there was another one. 27 years later, in the spring of 1986, I was watching television once again as a college student, this time of a shuttle named Challenger that held in its bosom a teacher named Krista McAuliffe. On that day, I witnessed tragedy with my own eyes as that spacecraft rose powerfully into those azure blue skies, turned slightly, and then exploded. I didn't fully understand it then, but those two events, man walking on the moon and the Challenger explosion, those two events were defining moments for my generation. You see, I wasn't a baby boomer at all, nor was I this ambiguous Gen X tag that got slapped on me in 1991 by a novel fiction writer named Douglas Copeland, and later expanded and expounded by generation analysis like William Strauss and Neil Howe, who wrote definitively on generations. But it did make me wonder, my friends, it did make me wonder, who was I really? You see, I've spent the last 3 decades studying culture, cultural change, generations. And as I did, I became increasingly concerned, as I've shared, with the labels and the brackets that we use to mark generations. Whether it's the GI generation of the early 20th century, Tom Brokaw called them the greatest generation, or the silent generation born in their shadow. The silent generation, which by the way has yet to produce, and it's really their last opportunity right now to produce a US president. The only US history generation to fail to do that. Or whether it's baby boomers or Gen Xers or millennials, or whether it's these ambiguous alphabetical tags that we give like Gen Y, Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha. Have you heard that about the new generation being called Gen Alpha? We're just going back to the beginning of the alphabet. These are lazy tattoos. I think we've got it all wrong, my friends. I mean, what does Gen Z really mean? What's a millennial? Why are they even called a millennial? Or a Gen Xer, a Gen Xer? And these ongoing arguments, if you get into the research, Gen Z is unbelievable right now. When does Gen Z start? When does it end? It's absolutely unbelievable. All these arguments. And really, did the baby boom generation, did it really start in 1946 and end in 1964? And what about the exennials? Have you heard of the exennials? This is a minor cadre of kids born between 1977 and 1985 who struggle to be connected with either Gen X or the millennials. And so they just created their own little mini generation. You see the reality? There's only one true guide, I believe, for defining a generation, and that's its technology. Let me see if I can explain and expound on that myself. Because every generation experiences technological change in different ways and at a specific time. I call it our coming of age years. And I talk about that. I have a whole chapter about this in the book. You know, the years that we come of age, we endure, and I believe these coming of age years are between the ages of 10 and 25. Between the ages of 10 and 25, we come of age. That's when we endure biological and cognitive, emotional changes related to puberty. It's when we commit to value systems and religious ideas. It's when we expand our friendships and interact in new ways. We celebrate rites of passages that include new privileges. We get to drive, vote, marry, have kids, work, go to war. We get to learn what we want, buy what we desire, live where we wish. You see, at 10 years of age, we start this journey, and by 25, we've largely embraced our young adulthood years in earnest. It's a good marker. It's a good bracket, if anything, for coming of age. Let me give an example. Think about music. Think about your music. Think about the music that you listened to between the ages of 10 and 25. For me, it was 1973 to 1988. And if you got on my iPod, if you get into my iTunes account, you're going to find that the majority of my music, my comfort music, is right there. It's 70s and 80s music. You see, the bands and the artists that you enjoyed during that time of 10 and 25, I think became the soundtrack for your life. Technology, I'm going to suggest, does the exact same thing. The emerging technology that we embrace and enjoy during our coming of age years, between the ages of 10 and 25 again, they create the special windows for how we see our world. It's what makes us comfortable and content, safe, and satisfied. You know, since 1900, our culture has experienced more technological change than in all of world history. Let that one sink in. Since 1900. And in the past 120 years, we've become motorists and pilots, astronauts and disc jockeys, computer hackers and digital artists. We've witnessed the rise of motion pictures, radio, vinyl records, television. We've watched the space race and communications revolution. We've seen the emergence of video games, cable television, personal computers, cell phones. We've experienced the internet, digital and social media, and now we're watching as our grandchildren and children mature into a world of holograms, artificial intelligence, and robots. In fact, in the past 20 years, just the last 20 years, we've witnessed more technological change than we did in the entire 20th century combined. And what's on the horizon, my friends, is unfathomable, even unimaginable. Technology changes us. Technology charges us. Technology, I would suggest and propose, makes us who we really are. Now, let's get into the meat of the book. Let me just give an overview of the book, because the book covers history. It's a social history. It's a generational history. It's a tech history since 1900. It's fun. It's engaging. And most people, when they read it, go, wow, the stories, because that's what it is. It's a story of who we really are since 1900. I'm going to suggest to you that there are 3 phases for technology since 1900. The first phase is what I call the audio phase. These are generations born between 1900 and 1950, and they're defined by motorized wheels and knobs, dials, spindles, and speakers. So let's break down each one of these generations, just introduce them briefly to you. The oldest one, 1900 to 1920, I call the transportation telephone generation. This generation fought in 2 world wars, endured the Great Depression, led America into the 20th century through expanding automobile and plane travel, film and television, entertainment, space technology, rockets and satellites. They were all part of that. They also experienced the emergence of telephone technology. This was the first generation to call on party lines, or call collect, or call long distance. It totally changed how they socially interacted. It was a generation of talk and travel. The next generation, born between 1910 and 1930, is what I call the motion picture generation. This cohort was too young to fight in World War I, but they still experienced the Great Depression and fought in World War II in Korea. They grew up in movies with sound after 1927. They experienced mass advertising, tabloid journalism, movie stars, and classic Hollywood. In fact, I was surprised when I looked at their coming of age years that it actually mirrors to the date classic Hollywood from between 1925 and 1955. This generation was a generation of projected visuals. And then there's the generation we know as the radio generation. They're currently between 80 and 100 years of age right now. They grew up listening to music and commentary, entertainment, sports, religious programs through the airwaves. Their first real interaction, get this, their first real interaction was with the radio. It was with their president, their US president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by fireside radio chat. They fought wars in World War II, Korea, and also Vietnam. They participated, this generation did, in the great industrialization of America. They built dams and interstates. They built suburbia. It's a generation of the antenna. The last generation in the audio phase is the vinyl record generation. They came of age in a post-World War II atomic age. They witnessed the rise of the Berlin Wall, Cold War communism, duck and cover survival strategies, the space race, and Vietnam. Now, their predominant entertainment technology in youth and young adulthood was the vinyl record. They played records for sock hops, barn dances, and eventually discotheques. Mostly, they dropped their needles at home on portable record players, launching a new music known as rock and roll. It's a generation of Sinatra and Elvis, and of course, the Beatles. It's a generation of needles and speakers. The next phase, that's the audio phase. The next phase is what I call the visual phase. The visual phase. These generations are defined by visual media and satellite technology. First up is the television generation. We call them boomers. I call them the television generation, born between 1940 and 1960. They're the American generation, the first American generation to experience television, first in black and white and later in color. They grew up on rock and roll and in a hippie culture, youth culture. They viewed the world through the screen, through the television screen, whether it was Elvis on Ed Sullivan or the Vietnam War news updates, Kennedy's assassination, man walking on the moon, Watergate, or the Reagan Revolution. It's a generation of live news. And then there's the space generation, born between 1950 and 1970, currently in their 50s and 60s. They've experienced a number of technologies, particularly related to rockets and satellites, space exploration. They witnessed nuclear missiles, man on the moon again, Reagan's Star Wars, and the Challenger explosion. As kids, they watched Star Trek and Star Wars. They learned of galaxies far, far away, thanks to Isaac Asimov and Carl Sagan. They dined on meals cooked in microwaves, listened to portable music on cassettes and 8-tracks and CDs, and were the first to hear and play on something called a computer. It's a generation of satellites and rockets. And then there's the gamer generation. They grew up playing arcade pinball, video games like Pong, Pac-Man, Asteroids, Super Mario Brothers, Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam. They played video games in the arcade, at home, with portable players like Game Boy, and eventually on computers, and now on the smartphone. This generation experienced new media and technology like VHS and DVD, desktop computers, the web, and cell phones. They are a generation of consoles and controllers. Actually, I'm part of that gamer generation. We may need to talk about that one a little bit later. It's a fun one. The next generation is what I call the cable television generation. Now, it's not the most sexy generation, I'll give you that one, but it is an interesting one. They grew up on cable and satellite television, music videos, VHS and DVD, camcorders. They're actually defined by the cable channels like HBO, MTV, ESPN, CNN, Fox, Weather Channel, the Learning Channel, Discovery, History. They came of age just as MTV and CNN entered the channel constellation. And its last members, this is interesting, its last members witnessed the beginning of the end of cable television as streaming options started to find appeal. And now cable television is a dying beast. They're the first time shift generation, thanks to VCR and DVR recording. It literally changed how we watch television, if you think about it. They're a generation of the box and the remote. Now let's get into the current generation, or the current digital what I call the digital phase. This generation is purely postmodern how they look at things, defined by digital, mobile, wireless, and cyber communications. Now, the first in this is the personal computer cell phone generation, or as I call them, the PCCP generation. The birth years are 1980 to 2000. We often call them millennials, but I think this is a better frame for them. They grew up with, again, computers and home printers and modems and Windows. It's a generation of the silver disc, the CD, the Blu-ray, the DVD. They're the first to live in a world of email, digital photography, cell phones, video projection. It's a generation of right and left clicks. It's a generation of the mouse. Remember the mouse? You used to have a mouse? Long time ago, it seems like now. PC, again, means personal computer, but if you flip it around, it can also mean, again, the cell phone. Remember this little guy? This is the flip phone, and this generation grew up on this flip phone. The PCCP generation saw mobile phone technology become mainstream. Next, we have the net generation. The net generation ranges currently in their preteens to age 30. They were born between 1990 and 2010. They're the WWW generation. They have experienced and consumed the internet for most of their coming of age years. They're fully digital as a generation, thanks to techs like the MP3, JPEGs, MP4s. They prefer laptops and tablets, GPS and DVR. They're the first generation to wholly adopt texting, streaming technology, Google, and a new way to complete an education called e-learning. In fact, I like to look at this generation as the Google generation. And then there's the iTech generation. We often call them Gen Z, but let me suggest a different name for them. The iTechs, born since 2000. They're comprised of teenagers and young adults right now, completely wireless and digital. This generation reads by touchscreen tablet. They FaceTime their grandparents, Snapchat with peers, watch Netflix, YouTube, and Hulu for entertainment. And they do it primarily on a single device, that smartphone. They're also the first purely social media generation. They've been known to use electronic types of things like vaping and emojis. It's a generation of clouds and streams. And that's a great one to look at here later as well. Great things to maybe come back and take a look at. Finally, let me introduce you to the youngest American generation right now. The youngest American generation, I call, oh, hold on a second. There we go. I call the robotics generation, or short, the robo generation. The robo generation will experience a world that's an internet of things, with practically every device, appliance, fashion, and thing being wirelessly interactive with the internet. Let that one sink in for a moment. This will be the first generation to fully experience robotic technology, driverless cars, 3D printing, genetic engineering, holographic images, digital money. This is a generation literally of artificial intelligence. Everything they do is smart and it's going to be smart. Now, if you've paid attention, as I've walked through these historical generations, you've noticed that they actually overlap. Essentially, you're not part of one generation, you're part of two generations. And for those of you born on those even years, I guess you could say you're part of three generations as well. You're born in the 0 years. But for me, it really helped me understand who I was. It helped me understand that who I really was. I'm not a boomer. I'm not a Gen Xer. I'm a member of the space and gamer generations. I was born again in 1963. I was born with space and video game technology emerging. Those are the windows of which I saw my world. I was framed by Star Trek on one end and Star Wars on the other. I was framed by Pong on one end and Pac-Man on the other. Between my 10th and 25th birthday, I experienced America literally move into space. And I saw the space program largely blow up in my face. It was a time when as a gamer, I played games like Space Invaders and Asteroids. If you look at it, my coming of age years, or again, capped by man walking on the moon. I was at that point 7 years of age, but I was 25 when with Challenger. They capped my coming of age years, framed, if you will, my existential American journey. And this is where I want to close, because this is interesting to me as I started to think about my own life. Because I personally, and many in my generation, especially those of us who were born in the 60s, faced an explosion in the Great Recession, not unlike the Challenger explosion, but it was an explosion economically in our life. It redefined my middle adulthood years. I lost my job in the Great Recession, and I never got it back. In fact, I've never gotten my job back. I haven't worked full time since 2007. It's just my world completely changed. Life for my generation has been a lot like a rocket ride, you know? But it's also been like a good video game. And as any good gamer will tell you, that if you play the game well enough, you always get second life or extended play for those who do it well. And that's who I am, my friends. That's who I am. It's why I'm here. I want to play this game of life as well as I can. I want to take this rocket ride in space as far as I can. I am GenTech. I am the space. I am the gamer generation. And you are part of a generation too. You are GenTech as well. Thank you very much. Let me stop my share. If I can bring back here. All right. Well, hopefully you could hear all that. Got all that. Understood.
That was a great presentation. If anybody has questions for Rick, please put them in the chat. And I see we have our first one, which is, what do you think the world will be like with technology in the workplace going forward?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's COVID has really changed a lot of what's going on out there. The businesses that have adapted the best in this COVID environment are those that have understood the digital frame as well. You think about restaurants, they've reimagined themselves. But we're going to see, work is going to change a lot in the next 10 years. We are seeing it right now. One of the reasons I named the Robo Generation is because there's a technology, and it usually starts to emerge in their 10th birthday. And if you get your eyes open and your ears open right now, the thing that's starting to explode in our culture technologically are robots. They're everywhere. Robots are everywhere. Down in Los Angeles, I just saw this a week or so ago, the Los Angeles Fire Department now has a robotic fire engine that shoots water further and faster and with greater volume than any fire truck can do it. Any person can do it. They've got robots now that can go into fire. You know, when you think about it, first responders are all going to be robots in the future. Our police, again, California is leading the way in some of this because they've got robot police that patrol the parks down there, RoboCops, literally. It's a different world. But artificial intelligence is also, everything's going to be smart, and that's going to change the workplace as well. Cameras, but especially the artificial intelligence. And I could maybe unpack that a little bit more, but I want to keep my answers short to get as many questions in as possible.
Thank you. And so what is it going to be like for children being born right now in 20 years?
Yeah. Well, in the book, if you're born right now, you're again part of that robo generation, being born between 2010 and 2030. And I take their coming of age years in the book all the way out to 2055. And it's very difficult. I can tell you, anybody that can project further than 10 years in advance, you start to, as futurists, I mean, just go back and watch Back to the Future, and especially Back to the Future 2, that movie where they went to, I think they went to 2015 was when Marty McFly went into the future, and he was in the year 1985. And I mean, there were flying cars, and it's easy to project 10 years, but it's very difficult to go much further than that. Here's what I know. I definitely think we're going to see a rise on the an emergence of robots in just about every facet of our lives. And that's why, again, the robo generation, we're starting to see that. Our children are going to be very influenced. Well, another one is holograms. Let me just talk for a moment about holograms. I call them the hair technologies. Our children are going to experience hair technologies, which is funny coming from a bald guy, right? But hair technologies, the hair technologies of our children are holograms, artificial intelligence, and robotics, HAIR. Holograms are going to change how we teach, how we educate, how we train. In the future, you can actually have holographic images that will be transported over the internet, and they're going to look very real. In fact, they're already getting to that spot. There are some, when I was doing the research for the chapter on the Robo Generation, I was just shocked at some of the stuff on YouTube when it comes to holographic technology. In fact, right up there in your neck of the woods, Microsoft has been doing a lot in the area of holographic technology. And it's fascinating to me. But the artificial intelligence is also, everything's going to be smart. Think about your clothes in the future, not too distant future. We're not talking a long way, but in the near future, your clothes will be smart. What you're wearing will be actually connected to the internet. It will basically let you know when you're thirsty, or when maybe if you're having a heart problem or a heart attack. It will actually sense that before you even have it. In fact, it will probably call first responders before you even hit the floor in the future. People will be responding to you. And think about and then you think about robotics again. You think about driverless technology, drones. In the future, I don't think it's going to be too far that driverless technology is going to be a big thing. I already have an almost driverless car as it is. I have one of those Priuses that has smart technology all the way around it. I can put it on the speed I want to go, and it will speed up and slow down. The only thing I have to do is steer. And when that technology becomes free, I won't even have to steer in the future. Our kids are going to experience all that types of technology. Yeah.
And here's another question. Are all generations equally resilient?
Wow, that's a great question. Are they equally resilient? Yeah, I think so. I think millennials often get a bad rap today about they're called snowflakes in some circles, and they get bad raps. Actually, I tell my millennials that you don't let that bother you too much, being called snowflakes, because if you stick together, we know what happens with snow when it sticks together. You can do some great things. And I'm from Montana originally, and I can tell you a lot of snow doing a lot of things can change things pretty quick for you. But I think every generation has its resilience. I think though that sometimes we have to work out that resilience in different ways. The millennials they're getting a little bit better. In the workplace, I think they've kind of had some reality checks. You can't. When you grow up getting, again, trophies just for participating, and they did, it can be a reality check when they hit the workplace and suddenly they don't get those types of awards anymore. But I think I've seen some very positive steps with the millennial generation as they've adapted to that. Gen Z, I was just talking with someone today about Gen Z, and they're seeing a real positive view with Gen Z when it comes to economics and such, how they handle their money. And I reminded them that Gen Z grew up in the heart of the Great Recession. They watched their parents lose their homes and their jobs and everything else. So yes, we would expect them to be more economically conservative as a generation. But Gen X has been resilient, of course, all the way through. We've kind of banged our way through. I'll give you a great image for those of you who like to think about generations. A lot of times Gen X, we get a little bit of a bad rap. We have some negative images. We were Goonies. We were Bad News Bears. We were Exorcist children back. That's how the media looked at us. The movies looked at us back in the day. But I like to say we're kind of the Jan Brady, if I can use the Brady Bunch metaphor. I know, Grace, you might be too young for the Brady Bunch, but the Brady Bunch. If you look at the Boomer generation, they were a lot like Marsha. They were just really, everything they did was just really celebrated. And then you had precocious Cindy. Those are the millennials. And right in the middle, you had Gen X. We were the Jan Bradys. And if you know anything about the Brady Bunch series, you know that Jan Brady was constantly trying to find her identity. And some generations, maybe not so much, I think we're all resilient, but sometimes some generations have a harder time finding their identity, which is why I like to move through these technological frames. I think the technology gives us that identity better, and then we can circle back around and talk about how to be more resilient. So, great question.
I know lots of great questions today. This is a statement and a question. This resonates with me. Born in 1960, I never felt like a boomer, couldn't relate. Even with the overlap, I would choose space and gamer as my generations. Do people often find their prior generation label to not fit?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Yeah. And by the way, thank you for that question. It was a good one. Yeah, absolutely. We have. That's why I was born again in '63, and I didn't feel like I fit. Now I think it's interesting if you get in 1960. A lot of times you get tagged a baby boomer because of the JFK assassination. And this is another thing I found fascinating. I talk about this in the book. Is a lot of times we talk about our earliest memories, and a lot of people will suggest that we can remember things as young as 2 years of age, but I would challenge that from a cultural memory perspective. And in fact, in my research, we're finding that most children don't have their first real cultural memory experience, which we talk about a wider memory of the world around them. That's a cultural memory until at least kindergarten. They might remember something as young as kindergarten, but definitely nothing in preschool. What we remember preschool tend to be home environments. We remember how we felt with our mom and dad, or we remember a particular memory that was pretty vivid or circumstantial to our life. That's what we remember. But we don't remember man walking on the moon if you're born in 1968. We were too young for that. But if you were born in 1965, you might. Yeah, but 1960, I'm a little surprised because that's definitely on the edge of that. But again, if you're 1960, you're actually part of the television space and gamer generation. So give yourself a round of applause there. That's special. Those generations on the edges can be very fluid, and that's the other thing to look at. I think we got to get away from these linear brackets again, where it starts here, ends here, everything just kind of fits in. Whereas if we see generations more fluid, working through these things. And yes, some technologies we may have been more adapted to. I've talked to a number of people who grew up in television age, and they said, we didn't have television, even as a kid. However, by the time they got into young adulthood, and remember, young adulthood is ages 20 to 25, I said, did you have television as a young adult? And they said, oh yeah, the first time we moved out, we bought a television. I said, that's why you're television generation, because television was still impacting you, even though you didn't grow up with it. Your coming of age years included that in your story. Good stuff.
Thank you. And here's another question. How are our generations affecting how we teach our children?
How are they impacting how we teach our children? That's an interesting question too. Are we looking at through a public school? Help me understand. I don't know who asked that question, but maybe you can help me understand what you were looking for.
Lynette.
Oh, Lynette.
Lynette asked you that question.
Lynette asked me that question. Well, Lynette, can you help me understand what you're asking there?
Yes, in terms of online learning, I mean, everything has changed. And I'm just wondering how many school-age children are being taught by grandparents because the parents are working during the day and don't have the same flexibility as others if they're working from home because they're working, right? So how does that generational gap, how is that working, And I'm assuming that's going to last for a while, right?
Yeah, this is really an interesting thing. I've been following this closely. My doctorate was actually my doctoral project was in electronic learning. So I spent a lot of time looking at it. And this was in the mid 2000s when e-learning and digital learning was just coming into focus. And a lot of the strategies and learning methods were fairly primitive in digital learning. But we've actually changed, and there's some great stuff happening here in Idaho, for example. Let me just give a statistic. we already have about 46%, maybe it's getting close to tipping point of 50% of high school students do online learning of some form or fashion. Before COVID, they were doing that. In fact, it's a state law in the education law here in Idaho that you have to take 2 online courses before you graduate from high school. So our high schoolers were already taking online learning. So for them to adapt to it, the hardest part for our students here was to lose the traditions. And when you ask kids today, is online learning all that bad? You know who it's bad for? I think it's bad. The parents are the ones that kind of complain the most about online learning. And the teachers do too, and for good reason. Most teachers today have not been trained in online learning. As a professor, I've been teaching online learning since 2000. I teach solely online classes at the graduate level. And I can tell you, it's a completely different beast. And many of our teachers in public and private schools, they just have never, they may have taken an online class, but they've never been taught pedagogy. They've never been taught good best practices for how to learn. So what they do is they take the classroom and try to make it online, and you just can't do that. You cannot take a physical classroom and put it online with any success. You have to think differently about how you learn online. And a lot of teachers so we're seeing here in Idaho, for example, a lot of the teachers really kicking back against online learning. And I'm going, that's because they haven't been trained. And we're seeing parents kick back on it because, they're trying to get back to their work and the kids are at home. And so they got to figure out babysitters and all that. That makes sense. But if you get down to it and ask the kids, especially the younger ones, is online learning all that bad? They're not complaining that much because they grew up on tablet technology. We gave these kids, tablets, iPads when they were in kindergarten. They're used to social media. They're used to screen technology. For them to have these, my wife is a parateacher and they do Zoom and she's got a young man who has no arms and feet or legs. He's just no arms, no legs. And that's her student. And she works with him solely online and he does great, in that online environment. And so they're really more adaptive than we think. What they're missing are those collective experiences. What our kids complain about, I think, is, well, I'm missing the prom, or I'm missing, going to a football game. They're missing those social experiences that we used to have connected to school. And my suggestion is, or my thought is, we got to be careful. Those things may be going away. I mean, we're playing right now college football without a crowd. And when that starts to kick in and you realize, wow, we can play pro football, we can play our sports without crowds, that might change entirely the model for how we watch football. Why go? I come out of the church world myself, and we're seeing this in the church world. The church is really struggling with this because they don't do online church. To them, online church is antithetical to the whole process. But when we look at how a lot of people go to church today, hey, sitting at home watching a church service, that's not much different than going and sitting in a chair watching a church service there at some physical location. I'm cool with that, and they're cool with that. So I think e-learning and digital learning is changing for sure how we look at the world. And it's our younger generations are much more adaptive, especially those born, the iTechs and the robos are very adaptive to e-learning. In fact, they're wired for it.
Thank you. Next question is, what about the resilience of the silent generation?
The silent generation. Well, maybe I better explain the silent generation to you. That's an interesting, the silent generation was a unique cohort of kids. It was a generation born, Strauss and Howe talk about it in their book, Generations. They wrote a book in 1991 called Generations, which is, buy my book first, then buy this book. This is a good book as well. They go all the way back to the King Arthur generation. I think it goes all the way back to 1584 with American generations. But they labeled the silent generation based upon a Time magazine article that came out, I want to say in 1948, that was kind of, being a little bit, let's just use the word mocking of the, and this is interesting to me. Every older generation tends to look down on younger generations with a bit of derision. Have you noticed that? The baby boomers got tagged with a lot of bad stuff when they were kids. I mean, the older generation looked at them and said all sorts of bad things about them. And now the baby boomers look down at millennials and say all sorts of bad things. Gen X, we got bad things said about us as well. But the silent generation was called the silent generation because they were just following in the shadow of the great GI generation. GI generation was born between 1901 and 1923. They were the war generation. The earliest cohort, earliest part of the cohort went to World War I. The older ones went to World War II. The silent generation grew up just in time to graduate high school and go to World War II, and the war was over. And so all these soldiers came back from World War II, and we had the GI Bill go into effect. So if you fought in World War II, you got to go to college for free. The silent generation still had to slug it out and work it out. They got to go to a war 10 years later called the Korean War, a war that we didn't even call a war for a long time. It was called a police action. It was called a conflict. It was actually the Korean War was the last war to get a monument given to them in their honor in Washington, D.C. They were the silent generation. And the reason they're silent is because they grew up, some of the most famous authors are guys who wrote books like How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. Their greatest influencers, they led the cutting edge of rock and roll, but many of their rock and roll heroes that built the genre are dead. Guys like Buddy Holly, John Lennon, Elvis Presley, they're all silent generation artists. And a lot of them died fairly young. Janis Joplin was part of that generation as well. Jimi Hendrix, they were all part of that silent generation of rock and rollers. So, but what's interesting to me about the silent generation is it did not produce a US president. I mentioned that earlier. It's the only generation that's not produced a US president. They were born between 1924 and 1942. And it's interesting that we have in this election, probably the last gasp for a silent generation. That's Joe Biden. So if Joe Biden is elected next week, he would be the first silent generation to ever be generation member to be elected president. We moved to baby boom generation with Bill Clinton. Barack Obama was Gen X. He was born in 1961. So he's commonly a Gen Xer. But it's interesting. Now, remind me, Grace, the question had to do with resilience, correct?
Mm-hmm. What about the resilience of the silent generation?
Yeah, again, I'd have to have that one unpacked a little bit for me, what you mean by it. I understand resilience, and I'm just trying to understand what the direction is with that particular question. In fact, I rarely get questions asked about the silent generation. That's kind of a fun one.
I think it was a follow-up for the question that said, are all generations equally resilient? Yeah.
Well, the silent generation, I have to say, has a lot of resilience because they were the kids of the Depression. They grew up and, when they were about 5 years old, the oldest ones were 5 years old when the Depression hit. They literally grew up in Depression. So yeah, they're fairly resilient. But they also were the ones that, when they hit young adulthood, were the ones that brought us out into that post-war prosperity after World War II. That was very helpful. They were the hardworking young kids that built the Chevys that the dads bought, the old soldier dads bought. Yeah. So yeah, they're very resilient. I really think every generation is resilient in its own way. We all experience history in a different way. We all have different historical, things that can hold us back and mark us and really hurt us, but we have to find ways to work through that. And I think every generation does to a certain extent.
Well, this has been a wonderful evening and it just flew by, but we have time for one more question. So here it is. Thanks for your awesome presentation, Dr. Chromey. My question is, do you see any changes in the way people interact generation by generation? I heard that recent young people have a phobia to get a phone call, maybe because of change in preferred communication. Do you think people in the future will have a phobia to interact with people because they become more familiar with robots rather than people?
Wow,
Great question to end this on.
Great question. I'm actually looking at writing a book on the robo generation next, just specifically on that generation. That might be one of those chapters I might just have to talk about is communication. There's a lot there to that. Here, let me, again, I think the future, whenever we go into the future and try to predict things, what I learned in my own studies is that the best predictor of the future is to look for patterns in the past. Okay, that's what a weather forecaster does. A weather forecaster just looks back to see the patterns of the past and then is able to project in the future. I think we're going to figure out a lot of these communication things. Many times new technologies kind of merge or emerge, and some of them, maybe for lack of a better term, burp for us. They cause a burp, and it disrupts us a little bit, and we struggle. You know, you think about how the cell phone is one of those types of disruptive technologies that's changed the way we communicate. Younger generations, you know, they prefer the text. They prefer Snapchats. They prefer very short, brief communications. And, you know, it's why YouTube videos the average YouTube video is about 4 minutes. You know, they prefer the short, you know, type of communication, which is why 50-minute lectures don't go over too well with them in college, by the way. They struggle with that. So, yeah, I think we're going to work out those type of things. Obviously, there's a concern, and I have a concern with robotic technology because it is getting very lifelike, and in certain parts of our being, you know, we really need a human interaction. We need human relationship. And robots, and we've seen this on Star Trek. So, I mean, let's just be honest, Star Trek, even Star Wars, but Star Trek, we know that what happens when we have a robot, you know, like Data was a wonderful robot, but he had no emotions. In fact, I think in one episode, they actually had to, program him to have emotions, and he still struggled with it. That's the thing about robots, is the emotional, you know, quotient to them. And I think with human beings, it's going to be the same way. We'll figure out the communication as it comes. I often think that the younger generation has cell phone technology figured out better than old people. You know, back when we used to fly in an airplane, that plane would land and everybody would open up their phones. You could always tell the old people because they would turn on their phones and talk, because that's what you did with the telephone. Younger people, they would turn on their phones and text. Now, which in a crowded plane is more socially appropriate? You know, it's texting. And I think young people are figured out, hey, you know, it's more socially appropriate to text in that situation. I think we figure those things out as we go. And robots are going to be a challenge. Hopefully, I'll see a few of them myself in my lifetime, but I'm getting a little long in the tooth, and who knows?
Well, we look forward to your next book, which I hope we'll be having very soon. And this was such a pleasure hosting you. It was such a fun and fascinating discussion. We definitely want to have you join us again, and hopefully in person in the near future when all of this settles down. But this was such a great presentation. The audience questions were wonderful. And you can purchase copies of Dr. Chromey's book. The link is in the chat. You can head over to our bookstore website, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone.